253, and this really is speaking again about the preparation for Shabbat, but in particular about food, making sure that your food is ready for Shabbat and that you're not we're not worried about, you're not transgressing cooking. Now the main concerns over here are, really the number one main concern. There's nothing from the Torah when it comes to your food for Shabbat. According to the Torah, we've already seen you don't have to worry about what your utensils, what your machines will be doing over Shabbat. The fact that the cooking is continuing into Shabbat, that's not any kind of Torah problem. And according to the Torah, there would be no problem with putting your food in any kind of fire at any point, as long as it's before Shabbos, and then eating it over Shabbos when it's ready. That's not the issue. The issue really is all Rabbanan, rabbinic concerns. And what's our main concern?
Stoking the fire.
That you're going to stoke the fire. So there's many such concerns we'll see around candles, around cooking, around all of these kinds of things. So that's the Rabban, the rabbinic concern. I just want to point out that when it comes to cooking, Rabbi Galvan did point out that cooking is a little different to other malachot. Because when you think of, give me an example of a different malacha. Writing. So with writing, you are doing the writing. But with cooking, you are not doing the cooking. With cooking, all I'm doing is putting the food on the stove, and then the stove is doing the cooking. Right? So it's really a grammar. It's really something done indirectly. Nonetheless, doing that on Shabbat is the problem. Right? Doing it before Shabbat is not such a problem. So this really is a prohibition, a rabbinic prohibition around making a fire. Because stoking a fire is the same as lighting a fire. So this is all a decree, not so much for cooking. I mean, it could be that the cooking is involved, but it seems the real problem that we have is not with the cooking, but is with stoking, with the fire that's involved. So the next thing is, what we're going to have to see is two things. The rabbis laid out a number of guidelines as to when they were concerned that you may stoke the coals. And their stoves and ovens are not the same as our stoves and ovens. However, we try to take all of those principles and apply them to our own stoves and ovens. And there's many teshuvot around Moshe Feinstein, for example, going through this in detail. And how does a gas stove relate here, and how does an electric stove relate? So we'll try to get what we can. So he starts chapter 253 by saying, when you're talking about a stove, that in other words got a stove top where you can put two pots over there. So if you're dealing with like a proper fuel, and here he talks about wood or olive waste, right? They would use after pressing the olives. The waste products would make good fuel, like solid fuel. So there you want to put food on it. There you're not allowed to do that unless the food is not going to improve through cooking it. It's already fully cooked, and leaving it on there into Shabbat, it's not going to get better as we go, because then we're not worried you're going to concern. There really is absolutely nothing to be gained from stoking the coals over here. That's the idea. The other option that he gives you is put something on this again. This fire, this most stokeable fire. Right? So the only way you can put something on the most stokeable fire is if there is absolutely no motivation to stoke it. And that's either because it's already absolutely as good as it's going to get, and any more cooking is not going to be to its benefit. So you really just want to keep it warm. You don't want to cook it anymore. Or it's so undercooked that stoking is not even going to help. So those are the two extremes. It's so ready that cooking's not going to do it any good, or it's so unready that cooking's not going to help it. So it's only in that Goldilocks area in the middle where stoking actually could make it better. That's when it's going to be a problem. Yeah.
So then you obviously then can eat it the next day. Let's say you put it in raw.
Yes.
Because raw is fine.
Yeah.
According to this.
Yeah.
So what's the issue then with slow cooker?
The issue with a slow cooker, there's no issue with a slow cooker. If that's what you would be doing, that would be fine. However, there are two things that we need to see. The one is, Thea, can I just ask you to grab the little white book? It's got a little white book with blue writing by my seat. Ezra's Torah Luach. I'm going to show you something there from Rav Henkin. The first point is the Mishnah Brura says over here, we're only talking about meat, is a number 9. We're only talking about meat because it's impossible to cook meat so quickly. Now I saw, here we go, that Rav Henkin wrote like this when it comes to preparing for Shabbat. Rav Henkin noted that in preparing for Shabbat, one should be certain that all food that is to be kept warm must be completely cooked before candle lighting time. The possibility of permitting kadei rechaita, food that is totally raw, placed on a covered flame immediately before candle lighting, that is discussed in the Talmud, should not be used nowadays. If the food is not completely cooked before Shabbat, there's a strong possibility that one might, heaven forbid, come to violate the Torah prohibition against cooking on Shabbat. If one wishes to leave hot food that has been prepared with a daytime Shabbat meal in the oven overnight, he must close the oven door securely, place some kind of reminder to prevent anyone from opening the oven until the daytime meal. So we'll come back to ovens in a little while, but the first point is that Rav Henkin did not believe that you could rely on that anymore. And the reason that he said is, basically because our methods of cooking are more effective. So therefore, now we've got a problem with the slow cooker, right? If we want to follow Rabbi Henkin's ruling that he says, you actually got, now I know nothing about cooking, but be interested to ask, if you would put, raw meat Erev Shabbos, remember we also bring Shabbos in quite early, and we've got a long shul service, right? I mean, it's not that long, but it...
Slow cooker, the max speed is 4 hours.
Sorry?
Depends what time you're off.
Yeah. So let's say you put it in at, you say the max is 4 hours.
Put it on high.
You put it on high. So let's imagine that you took it out after 3 hours. What's going to be? You haven't eaten the whole day. Remember that Friday that we fasted? You haven't eaten the whole day. You're there.
Yeah, you could eat it if it's chicken.
Okay. You could eat it, and if it was meat?
Meat? You could.
You could. So then the max is not 4 hours, then the max is 3 hours. Now you're putting it in at 6:25.
But if you put it on low, it will take you...
Exactly. So you put it in on low at 6:25, raw meat. And you say it's fine. It's absolutely fine, because there's no way I'm ever going to come to the violation. What happens is then you go to shul, you come home, it's already been cooking 2 hours. You say, you know what? If I turn up the heat a little bit, I actually could get it in a couple hours. My meal for tonight didn't work out. It actually is possible for me to have it tonight. 4 hours isn't that long. So in that I think supports Rav Henkin's case very, very well. Because nowadays, yes, I put it on low and set it for tomorrow morning, but there actually is a possibility, even with the raw meat, of getting it working for tomorrow. So that's now again the Mishnah Brura doesn't mention that, but that's what Rav Henkin says.
Sorry, Rabbi, who's Rabbi Henkin?
Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin was one of the great rabbis of America. Before Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he was the greatest halachic authority. He and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, generally speaking, got on very well, but Rabbi Moshe Feinstein became seen as much greater than him, but he was very, very great. His rulings can be relied upon. Whether there are others who disagree and still permit it, whatever, I don't know. I just remember seeing that. And he was also an expert, Rabbi Henkin, in the Lithuanian customs. So that's why he used to write this calendar that they carry on writing the same. They obviously adjust the days and whatever. But so that's when do you say Tachanun, when do you do this, when do you do that, how do you do this? So he covers all of that, kind of day-to-day stuff throughout the year. Okay. Now the next thing is so that's those two areas, right? So again, if it's not cooked at all, says the Shulchan Aruch, you're gonna then stoking is not going to help. And Rav Henkin's point is no, actually stoking is going to help. Mishnah Brura says stoking will help with everything except meat. And Rav Henkin says even with meat, right? If it's totally cooked, then cooking it more is just going to make it worse. So then there's no motivation to stoke. That everyone agrees. But we've got a problem with leaving this properly nice cooking oven that can be stoked, right? If cooking it more actually will make it better. Then he says, however, if it's a little bit cooked, right, or but not completely, or even if it's completely cooked. Oh, just let me tell you the other thing with Rav Hinken. The other reason for Rav Hinken could be, I'm saying the reason is, he doesn't say in this book why, I haven't seen his Teshuvah where he discusses it. Doesn't say in the book why he's not happy with that. I proposed it was because our ways of cooking are different. Could be another reason as well. When we say, Shabbos comes in at 6:20, doesn't really mean that Shabbos comes in at 6:20. Really means that Shabbos comes in at 6:38. You want to put it in at the last minute, but you want to be there for Mincha as well. And Mincha is at 6:15. So you're putting it in at 6, getting dressed, putting your towel, whatever else. It's had 40 minutes to cook before Shabbos comes in. So even when you think you're putting it in at the last minute, you aren't putting it in at the last minute. That could be the other reason for Rav Henkin.
Put it in and switch on low just at the last.
But what's the last minute? That's what I'm saying. The way the world works. I'm not saying it's impossible to find such a thing. I'm saying the way people do it is what we think of as the last minute. Could be 40 minutes before Shabbos. So then this whole thing is not applying. The Shulchan Aruch never said this about 40 minutes before Shabbos. We're saying it about 5 minutes before Shabbos, 10 minutes before Shabbos. That could be. I'm proposing that. I'm not saying with certainty. Okay. The other thing is, so now he says, so in that case where it could be better cooked, or if it cooks more, that will be good for it, even though it's fully cooked now, it'll add on to the flavor, whatever else, then we start being concerned. So what you need to do is to sweep out all of the coals, or to cover the coals with dirt. And the idea in both of those cases is that, again, you've now made it unstokeable. Or you've at least made it unusual, so that you'll now see. And the Mishna Brura makes this point that since you have now covered those coals, even if you haven't extinguished them or whatever else, you know for yourself, and you've made this sign for yourself that these coals are now out. We're not worried that somebody's going to deliberately do it, but we're worried that you're going to kind of just get a little confused and whatever else, and you're thinking about your food. So that's the idea here. And that's why we have this thing of putting on the tinfoil, covering the buttons in some way. Now, there is a question in Halacha. The difference between their situation and our situation. Talking about covering the coals. The control and the flame is the same in their time. The control is the flame, and the flame is the control. What we have with us is that the control is one thing and the flame is a different thing. So when they spoke about covering, were they speaking about covering the control or covering the flame? When you relate it to our stove.
They were talking about the flame.
So what you would say now, Theo, with our stoves, is that I must put something, like a blech, right, over the flame, and leave the control by itself.
Because in a fire, you're the control. If you braai, you are the control.
No, but I'm not talking about a braai. I'm talking about a stove, your electric stove at home.
No, but they are making fire in the stove.
Yeah, I'm saying. That's what they were saying. Now let's carry this across to our electric stove, where we're not making fire in the stove. We're turning the dial, and the stove's making fire by itself. So now what are you supposed to cover? Do you cover the stove, because that's where the fire is? Do you cover the dial, because that's where the control is?
You cover the stove. Because they're covering their flames.
They're covering the flame and the control. Because their flame is their control. Right? We've now separated the flame in one place, the control in another place. Them covering the flame meant that I'm now not going to do it, because the place where I was going to do it is something different already.
And by letting the heat remain, just covering the coals, is really just the control.
Yeah,
preventing the control happening.
That you can make a good point, although it is on the fire as well. So I'm not familiar with all of the halacha on it. I do know that there are both points are proposed. Some say no, you must cover the control, and some say you must cover the fire, and I think some say you must cover both. Now I don't know exactly what we do. I'll have to look into that. But this comes with a slow cooker as well. Because some people say it's enough to cover the dials, and some people say you also need to line the slow cooker itself with tinfoil, because that's the fire.
That's how we are taught.
Is that how you're taught? By?
The Sharia halacha in the conversion courses.
Okay.
So put tinfoil in the
the thing that goes into the
The pot. You put tinfoil in
That
it.
must be part of the controls, and then you've got that silver thing that goes into it. The silver one must something be in between the pot with the controls and the silver thing.
So
And you cover the controls.
yeah, so they're saying both the controls and the fire. Now I must check with Aviva, but as far as I recall, we just cover the controls.
That's right.
Right? Because we say the main thing is, right, to cover the fire is not relevant. Covering the fire is relevant when the fire is the control. When the fire isn't the control, the whole concern is that you're going to come to change the settings.
There's a difference between a platter and a stove.
Is there?
I
It
think.
is, yeah. And the stove.
Oh,
you
you're saying the hot plate.
extra,
Yeah.
but on the blech, you don't have to put anything.
Ah, see, because there, but that, Theo, that's what you mentioned to me. That depends on the setting or what kind of platter it is, what kind of hot plate. If it's a hot plate with only one setting, well, then again, it's not relevant to stoke anything. But if some of them can actually get pretty hot, and you actually want to just keep it on the lower dial, as soon as you've got that kind of thing, it could actually cook, right? So then it's a stove.
Some of them got different zones that do different things.
Yeah. So as soon as that I think becomes the case, then you're dealing with a stove. Good. The next, okay, so that's something that I just want to point out, that you seem to have both of these opinions. Some that say it's about the dial, some that say it's about the fire, some say it's about both.
So a lot of people used to cover with foil and now mainly cover the controls.
That's interesting.
That's what I've.
Is that what you observed? Yeah,
And I think a lot of it's influenced by what happens in Israel.
that's interesting. Look, I can tell you, I mean, with me, it's easy. It's whatever my wife did whatever my wife did in her home, you know. I mean, she grew up in a Shomer Shabbat home, so whatever she did in her home, that's what... in fact, I'll just tell you, it's relevant, because we're coming up. We're going to speak in a little while about putting fully cooked food on the stove.
It's very complicated.
Well,
Returning things though.
no, so the returning is a little different. So I'm talking here, I've got a macaroni cheese in my fridge. Shabbos morning, I want to put it on the stove so it'll be nice and warm for Shabbos lunch. It's an electric stove, it's been running, it's on the timer, whatever it is. So there, the issue is, we can't put it on the stove directly
You can put a plate.
because it looks like cooking.
Yeah.
See, what happens is, Jeff comes in, and he sees me putting the macaroni cheese on it. Now, you don't realize that it's fully cooked and it's all dry. So those are the two things. It's got to be cooked and dry. You don't realize that it's cooked and dry. You think that I'm just putting this raw macaroni cheese. So you come home and you start doing with the raw macaroni cheese. So therefore, we say you've got to do it in an unusual way. So the Gemara says you put it on top of a pot. Put a pot. Then you put your macaroni cheese on top of the pot. And then Jeff's going to see that there's something funny going on here. Now, what Aviva does when she wants to do that is she'll put a trivet. Now, trivet is that little metal stand that you put hot things on. So she puts that. So I said to her, Aviva, that's not big enough. The whole thing of the Gemara is that you put it on a pot. So there's clearly something else going on here. To just put it on a little trivet.
Is this on the stove or on a hot plate?
Let's say a stove.
Yeah.
Again, our hot plate I think can cook. So let's say a stove. You know, so our hot plate I think is like a stove. Let's say a stove. So you want to put it on a stove, so you put a little trivet and you put it on there. I say it's not good enough. The whole thing is you've got to put it on a proper pot. She says to me, won't you please call Rebbetzin Kirstach and tell her that? Because she clearly doesn't realize, right, with your great Torah knowledge, this is what she taught my mother. And she doesn't know the proper way to do it. So please tell her. I said, apologize, however, you carry on doing it the way. A few months ago, when I was in Israel for Yom Yerushalayim, I heard a shir from Rabbi Herschel Schechter, Rosh Hashiva of Yeshiva University, one of the greatest rabbis in the world today. And I stayed behind afterwards. I mean, it was, you have a shir with one of the greatest rabbis in the world. And afterwards, most people go. So I stayed around to just listen. I didn't have anything in particular to ask him. I asked him, I think, maybe something. I was asking about what time Shabbos comes in a community where they don't all keep Shabbos. I'll tell you about that more in a second. But there's another lady who was asking him about putting things on, whatever. He says, you know, this whole business that people have of putting it on like a little trivet or something like that, he says, it's not acceptable. You need a whole proper pot. And that's what the Gemara says. It needs to be on a proper pot. So, so there I felt justified, because he could go and tell Rebbetzin and stuff that it's, look, clearly there is such a thing there is such a view that this is sufficient. But I was glad to hear that my basic point, I think, was vindicated.
Because I think we were taught you only need to put tinfoil. Must lay the whole thing with tinfoil.
Yeah, so that's even less than a trivet, right?
But it shows that you're not cooking. Because it looks strange.
So that's the principle. But the
that's how
question
it
is, how strange does it have to look? How strange does it have to look? So from the Gemara, my understanding was that it has to look properly strange.
Because some people steam cook like that now. Pot and a pot on top. That's steam cooking.
That's interesting. So so my understanding was it has to be something, a real break in between. You know? Something that would not just be an aesthetic, that it looks different, but it actually is different. I think it actually is different. That was how I'd understood it. And as I said, Rabbi Shechter understands it that way as well. So I'm in good company. But, as you say, that doesn't seem to be the common practice. Common practice seems to be, is that in the Shari Halacha as well?
I don't think it's in the book, but that's how they...
So who taught you that?
I think Rabbi Ben Shlush.
Okay. So if that's, so that could be as I said, if Rebbetzin Kurstak does that, so I mean, certainly that's acceptable practice here. But that's the idea. That's the idea behind it. The idea behind it is that by doing this, people can see that you're doing something different. It's not like a normal cooking. So then they'll ask you what's going on, and you'll say, no, it's already fully cooked, and it's dry, and whatever. Okay. Now, the next thing is... then the Shulchan Aruch adds in this idea that if you put in one piece of raw meat, it's like the whole thing's raw. Because you don't know you're not going to eat the thing with one piece of raw meat in it. Okay, but as we said already, Rabbi Hinken didn't like that. Now, that's all speaking when you're dealing with proper fuel that we mentioned, wood and olive stuff. But if you're using like straw, then we're not worried about stoking the coals, because there's no coals to stoke. Okay, the Ramor says that if you have two pots sitting next to one another, and there's like this ceramic wall between them, and two stoves next to one another, there's like a wall between them. One of them has been covered over the coals, the other one that hasn't been covered on the coals. You're allowed to put your pot on the one where the coals have been covered, even though it's drawing heat from the other one. Okay, now we're talking about the next one is an oven. So now he says with an oven, then you're not allowed to put inside.
You should remove the coals.
He says there with an oven, you're tanur, even if you've used only straw, you're not allowed to do it, even if you've removed the coals.
But you can close it in with the clay. Is his next one.
Let's just see. Certainly you're not allowed to put on top of it. No, so he's not happy with this kind of oven. But again, their kind of oven is not necessarily the same as our kind of oven. So that's why you've got to see all of these things. Yeah. It says as long as it's the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo, then you're not allowed to put it in. Now, pardon? Inoan. Or al gabo, both. Yeah. Now, what's the other thing that I was thinking? Oh yeah, so what's Yad Soledet Bo? Yad Soledet Bo, the temperature at which...
Your hand, if you must... reflex.
Now, what temperature is that?
Well, it's probably boiling water. It's 90.
It's definitely less than boiling water. Definitely less. It's an argument. Some say it's 70 degrees, and some say it's 40 degrees.
40. Easy.
What's easy with 40?
40 is lukewarm.
No, 40 is decent. Try it. I tried it once. I used my mom's got a food thermometer. I used that and I put water at different temperatures. Right. So you put it in 40. Your finger after a little while it can stay there. But if you put your hand in, it goes ow. Right. Not like it's not properly anar. Right. But it's hot. It's hot. It's a little uncomfortable. So probably maybe it's 42 or something, but it's in that kind of range. That's the lowest that it could be, and the highest it could be is in the 70s. We'll see that we go strict both ways. We go strict to consider it like 40, we go strict to consider it like 70. And we'll see how that can be strict to consider it like 70 as well. Okay, now he says, but what if you forgot? And now then the Ramah says, but our ovens are really like the stove. Our ovens are not really like the ovens here. Our ovens are really like the stove. Because the stove, you're allowed to do it, and the ovens, you're not allowed to do it. And so our ovens are like their stoves. So that's where this idea comes in, as trying to compare what we have to what they have. Is our gas stove like their gas stove? Is our electric oven like their stove or like their oven? Because you have all of these different factors. So now he says, so you're not allowed to put it on this oven because this oven is really hot and there really is a danger of stoking the coals. If you did leave it on by mistake, you're still allowed to. As long as it's fully cooked, you're still allowed to eat it. But if you left it on by mistake and it wasn't fully cooked, then you're not allowed to eat it that Shabbat. And if you deliberately left it on, then you're not allowed to eat it either time. And then the Ramah adds in a ruling that when we say you can't eat it that Shabbat, you have to wait until after Shabbat. It is not that immediately after Shabbat you can have it. It's that you have to wait enough time for it to be done. So that's something that comes up. Kedei sheyasu. Because if you could have it as soon as Shabbos comes out, so then you actually have earned something, you have gained by doing this on Shabbos. So the fact that you can't do it until that amount of time has passed, so then really we can see that it wasn't, you didn't benefit from Shabbos. Okay. And what if the non-Jew put it back without you asking him, let's say, or whatever, he put it on at that point, so then it's considered like a Jew. You view it the same way as if a Jew did it by mistake. Okay. Now we go into the concept of things being a little bit cooked. Right. This is called Ma'achal ben Drusai. Who is ben Drusai? Theo?
The robber.
Yeah, and what did he used to do?
He used to eat very quickly.
Yeah, and so he didn't.
You say a third, but I think when you're going to read there, it's going to say, look the wording in English. It says a third to completion, not a third.
This is what it says in the Hebrew. Ma'achal ben Drusai. This is a Mishna Brura. Yesh omrim chatzi bishul. Some say half cooked. Yesh omrim shlish bishul, and some say a third cooked. The Shulchan Aruch later on says half cooked, and when you need to, it seems that you can rely on that. Yeah, so I don't think there is a thing about 2/3. What you're saying, Theo, is 2/3 cooked. I don't think there is a thing about 2/3 cooked. So there's a saying in the Gemara, Hamotzi mechaveiro lavaraya. If you want to take money from somebody, you need to prove it, right? So in this case, what I'm saying is clear in the book. You want to do it from this point on. The burden of proof is upon you. So some say a third cooked, some say half cooked. The question is, how do you evaluate whether it's a third or a half cooked? So they quote in the notes here from the Chazon Ish that it's based on how long the recipe says to cook it for. The recipe says to cook it for 4 hours after 2 hours cooked. Now I'll tell you why it's a good way of thinking about it, because for the first, half hour, 45 minutes, it's still warming up, it's only just starting to cook. So you could say, well, at that point, it hasn't really started yet, most of the cooking is only done towards the end. So the Chazon Ish said, no, don't do that calculation, just work out how long does it take to cook, chop that in half or in a third. Now.
I found it. The notes here. Some say it's halfway to completion, with others hold to mean cooked 1/3 to completion.
They mean 1/3 of completion.
But that says to completion, not all.
It's poor English, but you have to take that up with the publishers. I contacted them once, and they said, I contacted them, I found a mistake in that once, and I contacted them, I said, contacted them, I said, you made a mistake over here, this is the page of the reference, this is why it's a mistake. It was like a clear mistranslation, and it had halachic repercussions. It wasn't like the most serious one, but it was wrong, it was teaching the wrong halacha. And it was a complicated one, so I think most people wouldn't have picked it up.
They'll say Hebrews aren't right.
No, but what is it?
So they said, look, the book's out of print. I mean, we'll make a note of it, but nothing's going
There's a
to...
new series that's come out.
Is it, hey?
What is it called? There's a new series in Israel on Mishna Brura translation.
Interesting.
But the picture is Shulchan Aruch.
No, Mishna Brura. Thought we had a volume here. So.
Oh, yes, we do. That's right, the article. We do have one volume. It should be up there with the others, actually. Quite right. Bevan Franklin donated it to us. Yeah.
English,
Yeah. Take a look if you want. But that's what it means. When it say a third to completion, it means a third of completion. A third of the journey towards completion. So you're right, it's poor English, but that's what they mean. Okay. Next one. So what are we talking about with this Machal ben Drusai? So what they're saying is like this. Once it's at Machal ben Drusai, then you actually don't have to worry. Because it now is edible. If when Shabbos comes in, it's edible, so then it's going to be fine. Look, it's not going to be the best. It could be underdone. People might complain. But you have food. You have food. So that's actually a leniency now. That they're saying that it doesn't have to be fully cooked. It just has to be cooked to the extent of Machal ben Drusai, so a third cooked or a half cooked or whatever. So that's what he's. So that's why the Mishnah Brura says standard thing you should say half cooked. You should make sure it's half cooked when Shabbos comes in. But if it's really in a time of need or whatever, you need to go lenient. You could rely on a third. Beg your pardon, on it being a third cooked. Okay.
It's a quote. It's a tall volume.
I'll check later.
Okay, we'll take a look for you later. But did you hear what we were saying, Theo, with this third? Okay.
Yeah.
That so it's a leniency, or a
raw,
half.
fully cooked, or this robber guy.
But you see, this robber guy is now, instead of it being fully cooked, he's saying it actually doesn't need to be fully cooked. It just needs to be edible. So that's the robber guy. So the first opinion was saying raw, fully cooked, because anything other than that is not good enough.
But
This,
that rabbi said
this-
it's not okay.
you're correct. And this now they're saying, but there's a second opinion that there's a second opinion that a third or a half is also fine.
Because you could still eat it. Because
Yeah.
that guy ate it.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Your
I'm,
guests might complain, but they'll have food.
But I'm saying then you could stoke the fire. Because your guests going to complain.
But see, that's the point. That's the argument between the first opinion and the second opinion. The first opinion says, therefore, Machal ben Drusai is not good enough, because your guests are still going to complain. So therefore, you might come to stoke the fire. And the second one says, as long as you know that there is food for them, you're not going to end up breaking Shabbos. It's not just a question of, I want to please my guests. It's a question of, will I get so caught up in pleasing my guests that I will violate Shabbos? So the first opinion says, yeah. The second opinion says, no. And the Ramor says, who do we follow? He says, we follow the second opinion, that Machal ben Drusai. We saw in the Mishnah Brura, half cooked, it's fine. If you need to rely on it being a third cooked, you can rely on it being a third cooked. Okay, now he says, now we start talking a little bit about insulation. So now that all is talking about leaving it to cook on the stove. But now we're talking about insulating. So the way we would do it was they would like pack it in with coals or whatever else. So that's going to be problematic.
and materials. They discuss there later, I think, materials as well.
Exactly, that's what we're going to be talking about now.
Because there's that other thing that people these days put their food in.
Yes.
But later on they say, no, it's, at the end of the day it was fine.
Yeah.
It's like a bag.
So now there's an argument over here. What is considered insulation? So some say if the pot is touching the coals, that's insulation. If it's touching.
But everywhere.
No, the first opinion says if the pot is touching the coals, that's insulation. The Ramor then says, some say only if it's fully covered.
Yeah.
And that's our custom. Okay, so that's again, it's a second opinion over here. But he says we don't do that. We don't just see. So in theory, according to the Ramor, what you could do, you could pack this whole thing in coals and just leave one coal off the top, and so it's cooking like that. The problem with that is that you can't then take it out to eat it on Shabbos, because you're going to be moving the coals and So you're going to have to get a non-Jew to take your food out the oven. And so he says, so therefore, even though in theory you could do that, we say you're not allowed to do that. You have to leave enough space for a Jew to take it out. But if you forgot and you left it there, as long as you hadn't taken off all the coals, you can get a non-Jew to do it. And even if there isn't a non-Jew, you can get a Jew to do it, but you must be very careful not to shake the coals around. And even if some coals end up falling off, that wasn't your intention. Okay. Next bit. So now we're in number 2 in the Shulchan Aruch. So he says if you have removed all the fuel from the stove, or you've covered the fire, or whatever it is, then you're allowed to put it back as long as it's still hot and you haven't put it on the ground. And the Ramor adds 2 extra requirements, and you're still holding it, and you have intention to put it back. Okay, so it's those 4. Hot, holding, not on ground, and intention to put it back from the beginning. Under those circumstances. So this would be an example like soup. Take the soup off the stove. Now we left the soup on the stove. I now take the soup off the stove to dish up for everybody. But I know that there's somebody who's only coming a little bit later, so I want to put the soup back on the stove for them. So that's going to be fine.
But then you can never leave that pot.
You can leave that pot now on the stove.
No, but your hand can't leave it.
Yes. You have those 4 requirements. Correct. Still has to remain in your hand. Yeah. Because the whole thing that the Mishna Brura explains, the whole thing over here is you're not allowed to put it on the fire on Shabbat, even if it's fully cooked and whatever else. Like we said earlier, you need your big pot or your little piece of tinfoil or something. You're not allowed to put it on the fire. But you are allowed to return it to the fire. So when is it considered putting it on the fire, and when is it considered returning it to the fire? So when you had intention to put it back, it stayed in your hand, it never went on the ground, whatever else, that's all returning to the fire. But as soon as you put it on the ground, or you never really intended to put it back, or you took your hand off it, then it's not considered returning to the fire. Then it's considered, I now am putting it on the fire.
But why can't you then take that macaroni,
Yes.
solid,
not
liquid,
yes,
cold,
yes,
and put it on the fire?
Correct. So there, it's because you can't put it on the fire. That's exactly the point. In that case, you cannot put it on the fire. You can only put it on top of something that is on the fire.
Yeah, but if you take your blech and you put now that tinfoil.
So that's why Rabbi Schechter says it's not good enough. And that's why I also thought it wasn't good enough. Because you can't put it on the fire. You can put it on something that's on the fire.
But there's tinfoil on it.
Okay, so that's the answer. Put it on something that's on the fire. But yeah, we were talking about the...
so then can you take the soup?
Your soup, yeah.
There's foil, blech, foil, soup pot.
Yes.
Take the soup pot, put it on another table, leave your hands.
Yes.
Dish.
Yeah.
Later take it.
Correct.
Put it back on
Yeah,
the
because you're not
tinfoil.
putting it on the fire. 100%. This only comes up when this only is relevant when you're putting it back on the fire. I'll give you an example with us. So we cover the controls. We don't cover the
Of what?
The blech.
of the stove. So we don't cover the fire. You cover the controls. So you cover the controls. You've had it cooking or whatever. You now got your nice hot soup. You want to take it off and serve people, but then you want to put it back on the stove. Now we haven't got any cover or anything like that on the stove. So then we need to meet all of these requirements.
Well, that's a lucky thing. If you just put it in the beginning there, you're free.
Yeah? Unless you hold like Rabbi Schechter that you need a whole proper thing. Yeah. Now, I just want to point out of the 4 requirements that the Shulchan Aruch mentions, one is really a red herring.
Intention.
No, that's not a red herring. So the 3 that are relevant to this halacha are, it's all around, again, whether it's returning or whether it's putting on. Intention, I intend to put it back. Hand, I've still kept it in my hand. And ground, I never put it on the ground. If I've met those 3, then it's returning and not putting it. He mentions a 4th one, that it's still got to be hot. That's the red herring. Whether it's hot or not has not got to do with whether I'm returning it. That's got to do with whether I'm cooking again now. See, the thing is, there's a difference between solids and liquids. When it comes to solids, the difference between something that's cooked and something that's not cooked is the texture of the food itself. Raw meat and cooked meat are different, whether they're hot or cold. When it comes to water, for example, what's the difference between raw water and cooked water?
Warm and cold.
The temperature. That's the only difference. So once water cools down, it's now raw again. You can never make meat raw again. Once meat's been cooked, it's cooked forever. Once bread's been baked, it's baked forever. But water can become raw again. So we say the same thing with all liquids, with soup as well. So soup, once it's cooled down, it's now raw. And since it's raw, I can't put it back on because now I'm cooking. So that's the problem with putting liquids on the fire on Shabbat. So that's why he mentions these 4. 3 so that it's returning and not putting on. And the 4th one so that you're not actually cooking. And the Mishna Brura makes that exact point. Mishna Brura exact point. He says these three things are really as far as returning, and this 4th point is a separate thing so that you don't end up cooking. Fantastic. Now, this is where you see one of the differences between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, where you see that Ashkenazim are more lenient than Sfaradim. Sfaradim have a stringency over here.
Liquid. I thought it was the opposite.
No, this is what it. We Ashkenazim are more lenient over here. We have the easier time. We say, when is the liquid raw? So now I heated up my water and now it's cooling down. When is the water raw? At what point do you say the water is now lost its cooking?
Below that 40 degrees.
That's the Sephardi opinion. Sephardim say, once it's no longer Yad Soleret Bo, it's now raw again. Ashkenazim say, as long as it retains some of the heat from the original cooking, it's still considered cooked. In other words, as long as it's not room temperature. As long as it's hotter than room temperature. What that means is like this. I took my soup off and I left my soup there. I was holding it and dishing up and whatever for 10 minutes. It's now not Yad Soleret anymore. It's only 35 degrees. I can still put it back on the stove. Straight back on the actual fire and whatever. However, a Sephardi can't do that. He's got to make sure it didn't drop below Yad Soleret. Now remember, I told you there's 2 temperatures that Yad Soleret could be. Maybe it's as low as 40, but maybe it's as high as 70. What that means is Sephardi has to worry that maybe it's 70 degrees. He can't just say, well, it's 45 degrees, it's fine. If it's dropped below 70, he now can't put it back on. So he's got to keep it properly hot throughout the process. It's got to remain properly hot. Now that comes up, for example, even with things like urns, How low do you let the urn go or whatever? Or putting things on timers. I mean, it's an interesting question. Could you, when you have a power failure, during load shedding, this is always the thing. You had load shedding in the middle of the night, so your urn cooled down. It didn't cool right down to room temperature, but it definitely dropped below Yad Soleret.
Definitely.
So then Sephardim wouldn't be able to now use their urn for the rest of Shabbat. Because this isn't water that was now just kept cooked. This is water that was cooked. Whereas Ashkenazim, it's water that was kept cooked.
Oh, they didn't do it.
Correct. So we'll go back into that maybe in a little bit later, but that's the principle. So you can see there a stringency for Sfaradim, because for Sfaradim, as soon as it's no longer hot, you can't now put it back. Now putting it back is cooking with liquids. With Ashkenazim, as long as it retains some of the heat, as long as it's still above room temperature, you're still fine. Give you another example where this is relevant. Now you might say it's not. You might make a case that it's not a big deal if it's just a few drops, maybe, but a cup of coffee. Have a cup of coffee. Pour in the boiling water, put in the coffee, put in the milk, whatever, fine. And now I want to have another cup of coffee. So I want to pour in more boiling water. But there's a little bit that's left at the bottom of my cup that's cooled down. Now for Ashkenazi, it's not an issue. It's still above room temperature, nothing to be worried about. But for Sephardi, do you have to worry about those drops? That's a good question. I don't know, maybe. Maybe you do. I'll scrap
Maybe less than a 60th.
I don't think that's relevant. That would be a kashrut issue. Here it's a question of, are you breaking Shabbat? I mean, let's say you say, I just want to break Shabbat a tiny bit. No, I don't think we can say that. I'm just going to cook a little bit of the water. No. So if it's considered cooking, that could be problematic. My starting point would be to assume that it is. Maybe a Sephardi can explain to me why it isn't. Fine. But the starting point is to assume that to have that second cup of coffee in a wet cup, for a Sephardi would be problematic. For an Ashkenazi, it would not be. That's my starting assumption. I believe Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has a teshuvah and the same kind of idea, but where the cup got properly cold. Let's say I had a cup of coffee an hour ago. So now it definitely is room temperature, whatever is left inside. I think he has got something about it. I think he comes out with a way that we can have that even though it's cooled all the way down. But in principle, you'll see a difference there between Sfaradim and Ashkenazi. Okay. Sorry?
It's possible that I'm wrong.
Oh.
It does happen. Very often.
Then the Ramos says that there are actually some opinions who say it's not a big deal if you put it on the ground, you can still put it back. And
intention's not such a big deal.
He doesn't say anything about the intention. Does he say that? Yeah, he says again, if everyone agrees if it's cooled down, then that's going to be a problem. So even if it...
his intention was removed, was not to return it.
No, he says, no. Well, here he seems to be saying, had there been a dafka to be out of this, we required in your hand, and also that you need to have it back. Yeah. Oh, you're right. Yeah, that's fine. It's fine on Shabbos. Quite right, Professor. That even if you forgot all those other things, you took it off, you took your hand away, you put it on the ground, that's actually still fine. You can still put it back. But it's good to be strict. It's good to be strict. That's what the Ramo says. So the Mishnah Brura says, yes, indeed, it is good to be strict. But it's not a great idea to leave it. But okay, if you made the mistake, it's fine. That's actually very interesting. I don't think I knew that. In other words, we tell people what they should do. What they should do is they should keep their hand on whatever. But if you forgot and you took your hand off, so you can put it back. That's basically what he comes out with. We make such a big deal about having all these requirements or whatever. That's all just, that's the best way to do it. That's tov lahachmir. It's good to go strict. But that's not the absolute requirement. That's the recommended, preferred way of doing it. That's the preferred way of doing it. I mean, even ask like this. Let's say I'm busy doing the soup or whatever, and one of the babies starts crying, and Aviva wants my help and whatever. So can I stop? Leave it? Say, I'm coming back? Go change the baby, whatever, then come and put it back on. Maybe I can. You can make a case for it, because that was the custom. The Ramos says that was the custom. Okay. But of course, if it cooled down, then that's no good. Okay. Number 3. You wake up in the morning and you see that your food's been burnt. and you're worried that if you leave it there, it's going to get more burnt. So you can then take it off and put it on top of another pot on that same stove. Put it on top of an empty pot. Because then, it's still staying on the stove, but you've lowered the temperature. In other words, put something in between, right, to do that. And you've got to have the same requirements, that you should make sure it never cools down, that you don't put it on the ground, and so forth. Okay. Now he says what some people do is they put a thing of hot water into the oven on Shabbat, while the Erev Shabbat, they put a thing of water in the oven Erev Shabbat to keep it warm, and that's not good. He says that's not good. Why? Because what happens is, so what you do, you prepare water to pour it. I keep water in there to pour it into the cholent. Sometimes you need to keep a cholent hydrated, right? You see your cholent starts getting cold. Similar kind of thing. Can you pour from your urn into your cholent pot? On Shabbos, for example. So they're both cooking, right? They're both cooking. You're just moving it from one into the other. So he's not crazy about that, because he says sometimes the one really is hot and the other really isn't so hot. So you're going to end up cooking the one or the other. But the Mishnah Brura says, but we shouldn't be so worried about that, because even if it's cooled down a bit, it still wouldn't have cooled down to room temperature. So according to our thing, it's still fine, and that's what we do every day. He says, presumably means every Shabbos, but that's the phrase. Maaseh b'chol yom. It's what we do every day, right? What we do every day is we put some beans into the pot, and we pour. And we pour hot water from the and we pour hot gravy onto them. The reason is because these things are still hot from the cooking and whatever else, and it's all fine. So that would be the same thing, as I said, pour from your urn into your cholent pot. They're both cooked already. I mean, you're not cooking one, right? The cholent's in the pot cooked, and the water's in the urn cooked. So there's no cooking going on. You're just transferring the cooked things from one place to another. So he says, the Magen Avraham says, even though you don't need to protest. So the Shulchan Aruch says you must protest against these people. It's not right what they're doing. We're worried that they're going to come to a mistake. So the Mishnah Brura says you don't really need to be so worried they'll come to a mistake. The Magen Avraham says, even though you don't need to protest against them, it's still better not to do it. Rather, don't pour it directly, pour with a spoon or something like that. Okay. Next one. You're allowed to put on top of a hot pot on Shabbat food that was already cooked completely. Now that's what we spoke about with the macaroni cheese, in order to warm it up. See, now listen to how he says this. Mutar letait al pi kedeirat chamin b'Shabbat. Tav shel shenit bashal me'erev Shabbat kol tzorko. You are allowed to put on top of a pot of hot food on Shabbat a dish that has already been cooked as much as it needs erev Shabbat. For example, pan dish. I don't know what that is. Some kind of pie, like a pie. Lechamamam, to heat them up. Lefi she'ein derech bishul bekach, because this is not the way that we cook. And the Mishnah Brura says, because even though we've seen you're not allowed to put something on the stove, even if it's a stove with everything covered and whatever else, the reason is we're concerned it looks like cooking on Shabbat, because that's how you cooked. But to put something on top of another pot, al yedei hefsek kadeira, by having a pot in between, that does not look like cooking. This is not the way that we cook. Yep. Now, again, it seems to me very much like Rabbi Hershel Schechter said. We're talking about putting it on top of another pot. If you ask people, do you put on the stove? You have a little bit of tinfoil or whatever. I think it's hard to say, ein derech bishul bekach. This is not the way that people cook. It is the way that people cook. You haven't affected the cooking at all. You've just made a heker. You've made something that looks different. But that's not the language of the Shulchan Aruch. Ein derech bishul bekach. This is not the way of cooking. So I find that very hard. Let's see if they say anything in the notes. They say here that it's our electric stoves are the same as these kinds of stoves, so you do need to have something, but they don't seem to be going into this question of what. Okay, so that's what it is. Now again, you say the Sharei Halacha says it's fine. Yeah, and again, if Rebbetzin Kuzdak did that, fine, but it seems to me that it's one of the things that the book says one thing and the custom is something else. We have many such things, right? The way that we do it is not seemingly according to the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so that that I'm actually more comfortable with. To say that this is what the Shulchan Aruch is saying, I think it's very hard. To say that we don't go exactly according to the Shulchan Aruch. That's not how the Jewish people ruled. Okay, so there's other things like that as well. Fine. As we said, you're not allowed to put it directly on. You're only allowed to put it directly on when you're returning it. When it was already cooking, then you just took it off and you're putting it back. And now, what about putting it in the oven on Shabbat? So he says, if the oven is already cooled down, so now you've got your macaroni cheese. You want to put it in the oven. So he says, when it comes there, since you didn't insulate or whatever, there's just a little bit of steam, and you don't really need to worry about it as long as it hasn't cooled down completely. Some say that you must be strict. And if it's hot enough for Yad Soledet Bo, then you're not allowed to do it. Okay, so that's basically, we don't put things in the oven on Shabbat. That's what about having things on Erev Shabbat and taking them out? So there, it seems the main problem is what's going to be with your oven. Lights going on and all those kinds of things. But I don't know too much about that.
You do Shabbat settings now.
Is it, hey? Yeah, so then that shouldn't be problematic if you had it in from before, provided we followed all of these rules. Okay, then he goes into some of these things and having a non-Jew take it out for you and all those kinds of ideas, some of which we've mentioned. And he reiterates that our custom is to be lenient on Shabbat, even if you put it on the ground, to put it back in between, again, which means even if you took your hands off and even if you didn't have intention and all of that. Good, and that's how he concludes it. So that's the section of Shehiyah and Chazara, leaving it on Erev Shabbos, putting it back, taking it off and putting it back on Shabbos. And we also saw this idea of heating up cooked foods on Shabbos, that you need something. You need something. And it seems to Shulchan Aruch you need quite a lot, but it seems from general practice that you don't. You just need something. Good. Finish.